Sorry. I'll have to go back to this in a second. All right. So consider for a moment a tactic. The first exercise that I had suggested to you guys for becoming better at tactics is to solve tactical puzzles. And basic ones, right? Little 1 and 2 move patterns, which I said are in essence like the building blocks that are put together to create the actual calculations and more complicated tactics that come up in your games. For example, if you didn't have these rooks, there would be a known tactical pattern where you go bishop f7 check, king f7, rook takes e5, bishop takes e5, king takes e5, right? If you just imagine taking these two pieces off the board, bishop takes f7 check is a good example of the kind of 2 to 3 move tactic that I would suggest that you need to know thousands of and to learn them through the first exercise I gave you. However, even a tactic like that, and then my point would be that in actual games, you could then put it together in a slightly different scenario, right? And in a position like this, after h5, come up with the idea like, oh, I could play king f4, setting up this rook f7, and then you have to calculate that on rook f7, that you have a defense to rook f5, to rook d5, and to rook f7, right? That you've calculated all of those things, right? So that's how you then take those tactical patterns and put them into your actual practical examples and games, right? The bishop f7 idea pops into your head, and then you apply it, right? You're not just exactly playing the pattern that you know, but you apply it into a position that you get in a game. However, even a tactic of this sort, even like the simplest of tactics, can be broken down further. Even though I told you those were your building blocks, today we're going to break them down into something even smaller. And I will tell you that every tactic is composed of some number of tactical elements. Now, let me just tell you, you may wonder what's the point of learning what these tactical elements are. So I'm just going to tell you the like one sentence version. It's hard to fully explain it till you get it. But the one sentence version is, by understanding tactical elements and by learning to keep track of them, you can eventually create for yourself an alarm system that will let you know in your games when there are tactics available to you and when there are tactics available to your opponent. This advanced alarm system is extremely valuable because being successful tactically in your games is not just a matter of calculating well, but also a matter of knowing when to calculate. And this alarm system is going to tell you when to calculate. So that's why we're going to do this. Now that I've got your buy-in, let's continue on to tactical elements, the building blocks of the basic tactical patterns, which are themselves the building blocks of the actual calculations you do during your games. Tactical elements. Tactical elements are basically features of a position that can be used to put together a tactic. For example, this position here has a couple slightly complicated tactical elements. Sorry, they're not on this first page. I'm going to jump to the second page for a second for you and quickly give you this as a first example, just because off the top of my head, this happened in our game, and I thought it would be a cool link for you guys to see. This rook is what I would call a barely defended piece. It's attacked once and defended once, meaning that any shift in the balance around that piece allows you to perhaps do a tactic on that piece, okay? This pawn here is also a barely defended piece. It's attacked twice and defended twice. So this pawn here can also be the target of a tactic. And in fact, the reason why my opponent was fighting over this g4 pawn with h5 is because in this position, he figured I was threatening rook c to f7, winning the pawn on f7 simply by attacking it again. And that's why he played h5, trying to trade off this pawn and assume a fairly impenetrable defensive formation with the rook on f5. Okay, and before he could get his rook to f5, I found a tactic. And then finally, there is the hidden attack. So now I'll go back to the first page. Here we've got hidden attack. This rook is attacking this rook, and this rook is attacking this rook. The attack between them is hidden or obscured or blocked by another piece. These are sometimes called discovered attacks in English for no particularly good reason, and they're generally only used on the offensive side, like if I play bishop f7, I've discovered an attack, but you know, this rook is also attacking my rook. So what if I play bishop f7 and then I'm in check, and then when I deal with the check, he takes my rook, right? When did he discover his attack? So, you know, bishop f7 actually fails specifically because these kind of hidden attacks go both ways. So thank you, universe, for giving us this exact position in order to make my point for me. Yeah, so there's a hidden attack between these two pieces. That's another kind of tactical element. And then finally, there's a hidden attack between this bishop and king, right? And that potential attack of the bishop on the king is actually what gives us the time to use this hidden attack, right? So this particular tactic here is built up based on 2 barely defended points and then 2 sets of hidden attacks. And so you use this point here to be able to discover this attack while discovering that attack, this check, and then come over here. And with that whole combination, you basically win 1 single pawn. You could have also just taken this pawn, but this pawn's more important because this 2v2 endgame is a win, and the other one isn't. If you had the g pawn instead and they still had the f pawn. So the whole tactic is built based on these tactical elements. So now let's go through these elements one at a time. This is one of the more famous examples of undefended pieces. This is from a game between, see if any of you guys know, but meanwhile, I'll continue and look at this. In this position, what undefended pieces do you see? Well, there's an undefended bishop on d6 and an undefended knight on h5. Now, this rook is also undefended, and this rook is and these rooks are undefended, but these pieces are kind of hidden away, pretty far away from the opponent's pieces, so you could keep track of them as undefended pieces, but until they're a little more exposed, it's not particularly vital, and I don't take too much effort going over those ones. You know, keeping track of them. I don't count them towards my count. Okay. So the 2 relevant ones are these, and the solution is queen to d1, and after queen to d1, Anatoly Karpov resigned against Larry Christensen. I believe. Maybe I've got my own chess history and examples wrong, but I'm pretty sure this was the position. I'm pretty sure this is how Karpov lost in like 12 moves to a very, very simple tactic. It was a little surprised because the queen like developed to c2 and you don't really expect to see her come back to d1. Anand has had similar blunders to this. Everybody could blunder like this now and then. It happens. So here a piece was lost by queen d1, and that's because of 2 undefended pieces. So basically, there was this theory from, I think, Yuri Averbach, who wrote this book about tactics, in which he basically said that every tactic is based on a double attack or a triple attack. And so, like, a multi-move tactic would be based on you, like, make a move that threatens one thing and threatens another thing, and then eventually, as you play out those threats, they become actual, like, direct tactical threats. Right? Like you might be threatening another tactic and threatening another tactic at the same time. And so you could break it all down to every tactic involves somehow you forced your opponent into losing something because you had, you were able to make multiple threats at once down the road. What you will see with my tactical elements is that a lot of these tactical elements are basically things that you can threaten. right? Things that could be threatened, therefore they can be the basis for tactics. So undefended pieces are pieces which, if I attack them, it is an immediate threat. So if I can attack multiple, I can create a simple winning tactic. Okay, on to the next example, if I can find it. All right. The next example is a piece that can't move. In this case, the king is unable to move, and therefore you're able to create a threat that is devastating because the king can't move. So another kind of piece that is a lightning rod for tactics and attacks is any piece that can't move. And in general chess strategy, it is also in general good to attack things which can't move versus attacking things which can just hop away easily. You can waste a lot of your effort attacking things that can just move away when you attack them. Another famous example is basically this bishop on b3. It's a famous piece to also get trapped, right, by the move c4. It's another piece that can't move once you play this. All right. Then there are hidden attacks. Oops, sorry. Meant to click here. All right, so here I'm going to give you one from an opening we were messing around with recently, and we had a game in this. So here, this is one of the most famous hidden attacks in all of chess, is like the setup between this bishop and this queen. And basically, a lot of people call these pins, but I prefer to think of it, again, as a hidden attack because each piece can make threats to the other piece. So there's a matter of which piece is more valuable, but there's also a matter of like who has the timing on when the knight moves. And so there's like advantages and disadvantages to both sides of this kind of tactical arrangement, right? But basically at some point this piece can move. And when it does, these pieces will be attacking each other. And that means that if this piece moves with some other tactical threat, you have the recipe for a tactic because you've chosen to introduce the second attack at the same time, right? So for example, there's bishop f7, king f7, knight e5, king here, knight takes g4, which wins a pawn for white. Or similarly, and actually better, is knight e5 with this kind of an idea. So knight e5 introduces two threats, f7 and g4. It also introduces a threat against you of losing your queen, but luckily your other threat is even bigger than that. One of my previous examples here this kind of checkmate here. This one here was also based on a hidden attack between the queen and the king. And a hidden attack can be blocked by one piece, or it can be blocked by 2 or 3 or 4, right? In this case, the hidden attack is blocked by 2 pieces, but white still has this winning move here. Yeah, actually, in the example I just gave, interestingly, this knight e5 move, black's best defense is they can actually defend with bishop e6. That saves their bishop and the checkmate. And then you take, and actually this is better than winning back your pawn, because after you castle, these pawns are just so detrimental to black's ability to coordinate in his position. But that's a strategic element, which we won't dwell on. This position is strategically winning for white already, which is better than just winning back the pawn that you sacrificed. All right, so next we have an overworked piece. And I can explain that with reference to this very position as well. In this position here, the pawn on e7 has two jobs. One job is keeping the knight away from d6 since you have a king who can't move. The second job is blocking the queen's attack on his king because there is this hidden attack. So he's both responsible for keeping the knight at bay and stopping the hidden attack of the queen. Now, anytime you have, I wrote overworked piece because it was short enough to fit into my graphic, but what I really call this is pieces with many responsibilities. Multiple responsibilities, okay? Any piece that has more than one tactical responsibility, like I'm defending this and I'm blocking this, or I'm blocking this and I'm blocking that, or I'm defending these two things, or I'm defending this and keeping their knight off of a fork square. Any piece like that that has multiple responsibilities can become a basis for a tactic, okay? And if I clear the board for a second, here's like a tactic that I really like. It's a very, very simple one, right? Black to move. So you check here, and in this position here, you have a piece with two different responsibilities, right? It's just defending two pieces. That to me is like one of the simplest ways of understanding how a piece with multiple responsibilities can lead to a tactic, right? And here, for example, you play check, takes, check, and you come out ahead of rook because the king fulfilled one responsibility and then was no longer fulfilling the other. Now that won't always be the case, because there are examples like this. A piece with multiple responsibilities does not guarantee a tactic, but it could be the basis for an attack, right? A position like this, your opponent can play rook d4, king d4, rook c3, king c3. Your king carried out both defenses at the same time. That happens as well, right? Claude 42, it is definitely a good example of overworked. It is not a pin. A pin is a word I do not recognize. All right, so I'll quickly repeat this for Claude just to make sure that we're all on the same page here in agreement. This pawn has two responsibilities. It's stopping knight d6 and it's stopping queen takes on e8. Just as in a position where you have, let's say, like a knight on f3 and a bishop on g4, and a knight on e5, this knight has two responsibilities. It is defending the knight on e5, and it is involved in hiding this attack between the bishop and queen. So a move like knight takes e5 can be a tactic because this piece is overworked. It's exactly the same thing. The piece has two responsibilities. One of those responsibilities may be blocking a check or blocking a hidden attack, and so you see a pin. But that's one of the responsibilities of the piece, is that this piece is preventing the bishop from taking the queen. That's why he's not wandering to g5, e4, c3 right now, right? The only reason he's not going for a joyride is because he has this responsibility. So these are multiple responsibilities on a piece. And there are basically tactics which are called overworking tactics, and overworking tactics imply that there is a tactic based on that piece. But I just had to fit the words in. But the real tactical element is called pieces with multiple responsibilities. All right, finally, let's show a little quick thing to get here. Finally, there's something which I call connection with key square. Okay. In this position, the knight has come in contact with a key square, tactically a key square. It's a square on which the knight would affect two different threats, right? And it's also a somewhat poorly defended square. So the knight being in contact with a key square, that in itself is a tactical element. So in this position, black's not able to play d5, which is a desirable central move, without losing a pawn, because after pawn takes, if you play queen takes, you lose to knight c7. The reason is here, you now have a piece with multiple responsibilities. The queen was responsible for defending this d5 pawn that we pushed forward, right? She's also responsible for keeping the knight out of this key square. So the queen has multiple responsibilities. White takes. Now, if black takes with the knight, white again makes use of the queen's multiple responsibilities and his knight's contact with this key square to play the move queen d5. And this is based on the knight, the square being super key, right? The square was actually in contact with both the king-rook double attack, but it was also in contact with the d5 square that the two players were fighting over strategically in this opening, right? In this opening here, once white has chosen to allow this c-pawn for d-pawn trade, a key square strategically for white is controlling d5. It's a potential outpost, and it wants to keep this pawn backward, not let it advance. So it's very critical, like what's the tactical situation around this d5 square at all times? And the knight is now in contact with c7, which is in contact with all of these squares. So to me, that's a very nice example that's always stuck in my head of like an example of being in connection with a key square. Now from this first set of tactical elements, we can then derive the second set. Yes, there are two pieces that have a responsibility of defending this d5 pawn. Okay, there's the queen and the knight. This tactic here is also based on the fact that this pawn is attacked twice and defended twice. As we'll see on this next page here, we have barely defended pieces, right? So this pawn is an example of something attacked twice and defended twice. Meaning if anything goes wrong, if any little something goes wrong, we might be able to win something on that using the threat to d5. So yes, there's two pieces with responsibility to defend d5. White takes, and then if black takes with the knight, white takes again and wins. Okay. If black throws in the move a6, then the knight retreats to c3, reinforcing the d5 pawn. And white has successfully won control over the d5 square via tactics, right? Via this knight's agility. It's able to actually control d5 from b5 via this tactic, the key square. And when chased by a6, it's able to then reposition and still control this square. And that's a trick that knights can sometimes do. Normally they're hopping from light to dark squares. So normally if you attack a knight, it'll always have to hop to a square from which it can no longer control the square it used to control, right? Now it's controlling, right? First it was controlling dark squares. And then when you attack it, now it has to control light squares. But because of the knight's ability to have like contact with some kind of double attack square, it can sometimes maintain control of a certain square while actually, you know, hopping off of direct control for a move and having indirect control through basically a double attack or triple attack threat on some key square. Yeah, knight on c3 blocks development a little bit, and white has to sort out this knight here, but they have won this pawn. This is a real variation. I mean, Kasparov has sacked this pawn as black before. He doesn't play a6, but rather he plays like bishop c5 or something like that, or bishop to b4 are both possible. And the game goes on. White has to spend extra time on this knight, you know, moving it extra times to maintain their extra pawn. It's a gambit variation. It exists, right? But tactically, black has lost the first round of tactical control over d5. Okay? Yeah, it's a known gambit. This is a known position from opening theory, absolutely. And I'm not saying it's unplayable for black because they lost a pawn. There's many openings where you lose a pawn to a tactic, but like you knew about it and you allowed it on purpose for some other gain, right? But this is explaining the tactical basis for how you lost that pawn. Okay, so just as an undefended piece can easily generate a threat because if it gets attacked one more time, from that we derive barely defended pieces and open lines to valuable pieces. Okay, so barely defended pieces are something like this, where the balance of attackers to defenders is 2-2 or 3-3 or 1-1. So an undefended piece is just a special case of barely defended, right? It's 0 attackers and 0 defenders is an undefended piece typically. So you can also have 2-2, 3-3, 4-4, and like any little thing could change the balance and allow you to then win something based on it, right? Like your G pawn could come to G5, attack one of the defenders. If it moves away, you've done a tactic, which is usually called remove the defender, and then you win the pawn. That makes sense? So anytime you have something with equal attackers and defenders, there's the potential to make a tactical threat against that. Similarly, sorry, I'm going to do another one here. Let's just, let's go C4, D5, knight C3, knight F6, CD5, knight D5, knight F3, bishop G4, D3, E6. Similarly, an open line to a valuable piece can serve a similar purpose as an undefended piece. Essentially, a king always counts as an undefended piece because whether or not you can recapture it is of no importance or meaning at all, right? You can't afford to trade the king. So the king being on an open diagonal is in itself always a tactical element. And so here, for example, queen to A4, you make basically the same kind of tactic as queen D1 in that Christensen-Karpov example, right? You're just doing a basic double attack, but you're using one undefended piece and one piece that's just valuable on an open line, okay? The same thing can happen with like a rook on an open diagonal. How do I get to where I want to get to? Nope, that's not where I want to get to. Here. I'm not getting there. Sorry, guys. I messed this one up. I'm going to have to just set up the way I want it. So I'll take some of these pieces off. Okay. So after takes, you get one attack on a barely defended piece, and then one attack on a piece that is defended, but it's a valuable piece on an open line. So this piece is defended, but the defense doesn't matter if the piece is too valuable. Okay, so that's how you can use an open line on a valuable piece as basically a tactical element, and not the fact that the piece is undefended or whatever. The example that you give doesn't quite do it. This variation here. A4, C6, takes, queen F3. This tactic here is not based on the fact that the rook is a valuable piece on an open line. It's based on two factors from the very first slide. The rook is an undefended piece and an immovable piece, right? So it's an example of our two most basic things, right? The rook is undefended and it can't move, and therefore it is subjected to a tactic all on its own. And this is an example of the kind of tactic that I think might be the exception to Averbach's theory about every tactic being made up of double threats, double threats, double threats. Here we're just using one piece that is so badly placed on both undefended and immovable. We just make a simple threat to it, and the opponent is just too awkwardly placed to do anything about it, and we win outright, right? So here, you know, this is a more valuable piece than the rook attacking it. If the rook could be defended, the queen couldn't take it, right? So this is not an example of a valuable piece that's on an open line. It's just a piece that can't move and that is also undefended and undefendable. So that's open lines to valuable pieces, and then we've got barely movable pieces. All right, here I'll just paste one of my fens rather than just inventing something new based on what we've got in front of us. Here you have a bishop, which seems to still be able to move. However, if we play the move c5, we're able to drastically reduce this bishop's mobility, right? We create a barely movable piece, a piece that only has a very small area in which to move. And once a piece has only a very small area in which to move, then you can look for tactics around trapping it, right? So c5, and the idea is takes. Now you play a3, preventing the bishop from ever retreating along this diagonal. He retreats, you take, and basically you have an unstoppable threat of following up with b4, and you've created a kind of slightly more complicated, delayed Noah's Ark trap of the bishop, right? Like the first one that we saw of like a piece that couldn't move. Just a little bit more complicated, but an example of like spotting a piece that, you know, where you can kind of cut off its mobility and suddenly you've got a barely movable piece, and then you can go after it. Also, basically all checkmate tactics are based on this, right? Almost all checkmate tactics are based on a king that can barely move, right? It's not normally that like your opponent's king can't move at all and you're just trying to find some way to check him, right? The king is like barely, first of all, not a very mobile piece, but then let's say like you get into a situation where like you're attacking, you're starting to take away some of the squares around him. Well, now you start looking for checkmates. You've got a barely movable piece, and your tactic is based on taking away the last couple squares it can move to and trapping that piece. So that's the subcategory of an immovable piece is a barely movable piece. And then also from this connection with key squares, we get this geometric arrangement of the pieces. Does d5 not work? No, d5 doesn't work because white won't take it, right? You just leave this pawn here and you come to b1 or c2 or something, and yeah. And this piece is still trapped. All right, so geometric arrangement of the pieces. And this actually encompasses like a whole swath of extra examples. But for example, one of the ones that we talked about is we talked about the knight's contact with c7. Well, this is based on the geometric arrangement of the king and rook on squares where they are a knight move apart, and so a knight can double attack them, right? Another example of a geometric arrangement of the pieces would be, if you guys have ever seen this, this is kind of like a beginner version of the not open Sicilian. Have you guys seen this arrangement of pieces? This is an arrangement of pieces where you've arranged your two pieces in the exact shape in which a pawn can attack them, and then d5, d4. So arranging your own pieces the way a knight can double attack you, or the way a pawn can double attack you, or it can be what's this stupid trap again? here, here, check, here, takes. It can be setting up your king and queen on a diagonal the way a bishop moves, or on a file the way a rook moves, right? And then having that geometric arrangement of your pieces used to create some kind of attack that you can't get out of, or that costs you something, right? Because chess is just a geometric game, so specifically arranging your pieces such that they can get double attacked or triple attacked, etc., by your opponent's pieces, or attacked in a row so that whichever one steps out of the way, they take the next one. All that kind of geometric arrangements are bases for tactics in chess. Okay, so now you've got the basic tactical elements. You know, I could show you another like 30 examples to make sure you understand what each of these are, but we're gonna go this far for the moment. If you have questions about it or things you're unclear about, you can always ask me more questions. I can put up more examples in a future longer video if you want. They do look so nice when they're all geometrically arranged. In this case, I think they look especially nicely arranged to black, but I could be wrong. But now we're going to move on to incorporating this concept of the tactical elements into your play. All right. Using two exercises. There's two exercises you can do to start keeping track of tactical elements and turn them into your own alert system, as I introduced at the beginning of this segment. Turn them into your own alert system to know when there are going to be tactics. All right? First of all, I will say this. There's not a hard and fast number, but if you have somewhere around 5 to 6 bad tactical elements in your position, there becomes a very high chance that your opponent has the potential to play a tactic against you. Similarly, if your opponent has 5 or 6 bad tactical elements, there's a very good chance that you have a tactic available to you to take advantage of that and win something from your opponent or force something advantageous. Okay, now what happens for me when I'm playing along, and any of you who've watched my like blitz games, you may have noticed this occasionally, that I'll be playing a game and I'll say something and we haven't yet calculated anything bad happening to me, but we'll be in some position. I'll be like, ooh, around here I feel like my opponent probably has like a knockout move if they find it, but I can't help it. My position's bad, you know, where's it coming from? Kind of thing, right? That's because I keep track of this subconsciously. I'm going to ask you to keep track of it consciously until it becomes subconscious for you. I'm trying to replicate and create for you a thought process that I already have. But I have a subconscious process that's keeping track of how many loose dangling things I have, and it tells me when my belly's exposed and I'm about to get gutted. And it does the same thing for my opponents and tells me when to be like, okay, now I'm going to stop improving my position and actually just destroy this guy. So what you want to do is you want to start keeping track of all the tactical elements while you play through games or while you play a game. So we'll start with the first one. You play through the moves of a game. So you could take the Carlsen-Karyakin game. You could take a game out of a book. Any kind of game, doesn't even matter how good or bad it is or anything. And you just start playing through the moves, and every time you make a move, you make a mental note of what tactical elements have just occurred. Welcome, Cluso. We're in the middle of a lesson, so I imagine you might be slightly disoriented for a minute or two, for which I apologize. But welcome to the stream. I think you will find this is a great place for you to get back into chess and into learning and improving. So for example, on the first move, I'm giving you guys a game. On the first move, e4. What new tactical elements are there? Well, the relevant one is that there's now a new undefended piece, the pawn on e4. That's what you keep track of. If you're saying like, oh, my bishop can move now, or oh, my queen can move now, no, that's development. That's not tactics, okay? If you're saying there's an open line to the queen, that would be a tactical element, right? Open lines to valuables. So there's an open line to a valuable. There's a new undefended piece. Okay? All right, my next move, e5. Now, what new tactical elements are there? First of all, you don't need to restate that the pawn is undefended. It was undefended last move, now it's still undefended. You're keeping track of it, but that's not something that's changed. What's new is there's now an undefended piece on e5, and both of these undefended pieces cannot move. There's also an open line to this valuable piece. New tactical elements, no longer an open line to this valuable, and this piece is now like actively under attack. New tactical elements. This is now a barely defended piece. Attacked once and defended once. Thus, potentially the target of tactics, just the same as the undefended piece here. All right. New tactical elements after bishop b5. You guys should be practicing by trying to like say these as we're going. That's the only way to get stuff. You have to actively participate and practice all the time. So, new tactical elements after bishop b5. All right, I'm going to assume you guys are guessing and that there's a 5-second delay, and I'm going to start giving my answers. There's an undefended bishop on b5. There's now a hidden attack between the bishop and the king. Right? And this piece, the knight, is now both defending this pawn and partly engaged in blocking the bishop from taking the king. So it is a piece with multiple responsibilities. Awesome. You go, Mezco. I don't know. Your name is in such a bright neon color for me that I can't read it very well, but I think you're Mezco or something like that. Good for you. I'm encouraged. I'm glad you're doing it. So we've got that, and we've got the potential to remove the defender of the e5 pawn. But there's another important tactical element that people almost never notice in this position. And that is that there's a new undefended piece on g2. The reason is this, and I'm just going to throw this in as a very, very valuable aside, as I always try to do. When you move a piece, your attention and the attention of your opponent is almost always drawn to the area of the piece that you've moved. But people seldom look at in the same way the area the piece has moved away from. That is why very often you play a move towards the queen side and don't realize that you allowed your opponent a tactic on the king side. And maybe they don't even notice it because they're just looking at where you moved on the queen side and looking at this kind of stuff, okay? But mathematically, on average, every time you move a piece, it affects the area you move it to just as much as it affects the area you moved it away from. Typically, it's almost equal, right? The effect where you move is comparable to what you've taken away from somewhere else. So you may be moving from a less important place to a more important place. In general, if you're playing well, that should be the case. But you really need to be aware that when you move a piece, you're affecting where you moved away from just as much as the place you're moving to, right? That's like when you're moving a pawn forward and you're gaining a new square, but you're creating like a new weakness, right? A new square you could never return back to and defend with your pawn, a new potential outpost for your opponent. Give squares to get squares, like Fisher said. Every time you're going for something, you're giving something as well. So this is something to be aware of, that you moved away from that. All right, and our game continues. A6. So now new tactical elements. Well, there's really only one. It's just that this undefended piece is now also attacked. Bishop takes c6. Okay, now what new tactical elements are there? Well, there's still an undefended piece, right? That's attacked, presumably about to be captured. Now this pawn is the only piece blocking this attack. And now this pawn is undefended instead of barely defended. black recaptures. Any new tactical elements here? Just that this pawn is no longer responsible for keeping the bishop off the king, right? There's no longer this hidden attack between a bishop and the king. There's no longer a hanging piece on c6. Okay, let's do another move. White takes on e5. What new tactical elements do we have now after knight takes on e5? Well, we no longer have the undefended pawn on e5. But we have something very important to notice, which is an undefended knight on e5. This is extremely important because there's an ebb and flow to tactical energy in chess, and this is one clear example where you guys can see how that works. Almost any time you capture something from your opponent, you do so with an undefended piece. It's very uncommon that you would have this e5 pawn sieged by like 3 or 4 pieces and not have taken it yet, and then finally you pluck it and the piece that captures it is completely safe and outposted on e5, right? Like, are you going to capture on e5 and your knight is already defended by like a pawn on d4 and a bishop on b2? Like, absolutely not, right? So it's important to realize that almost any time that you capture something, here black has a bad tactical element, you have 2 bad tactical elements, right? In terms of these like obvious hanging pieces, right? Or undefended pieces. After you take, now black has no bad tactical elements. You've removed their bad tactical element. You've excised it, right? You were burning tactical energy to capture this. You've used all your tactics. You don't have a hidden attack on their king anymore. You don't have an undefended pawn on e5 to attack anymore. You've burned up their bad tactical elements. And you've exposed yourself to go out and take something from them. So you now have like an undefended knight on e5 on top of your undefended pawns on e4 and g2. Okay, so this is very important. This is the ebb and flow of tactical energy at like one of its simplest, most obvious examples from an opening that you guys are most likely familiar with and have seen this position before. And I purposely use this kind of an example so that you're not in unfamiliar territory and it's easier for you to really like think about it more and get at the crux of what's happening here. So the new tactical element is this undefended knight on e5. From this position, black can play queen g5. The other thing here would be that your knight is in contact with, yeah, it's not all bad for white. The knight is now in contact with a key square on f7, and f7 is now a barely defended pawn. So yeah, so as you advance, you sometimes come in contact with new tactical opportunities for yourself. All right, we play queen g5 for black. So what are the new tactical elements here? These are now not only undefended but attacked. And additionally, the queen has a hidden attack between it and the bishop. And we have a valuable piece on... We have an open line to a valuable piece as well, right? The game continues. So now what are the new tactical elements here? Well, the knight on e5 is defended. It's barely defended. So if the queen didn't have to run away, so this may seem irrelevant to you, but you know, you could play moves like c5 attacking the defender of the knight, right? It's now a barely defended piece instead of an undefended piece. A good question. Would I consider something an open line to a valuable piece even though you can't get to it? Sort of, yes. It depends on the example, right? Like, if there were an open long diagonal to this rook, but I didn't even have a light squared bishop or a queen, then I would not consider that a tactical element, right? Because I have knights and rooks. An open diagonal to your rook doesn't matter anymore if all I have left are knights and rooks to go after it. In this case here, yes, your bishop can't take the queen. Yes, if you play like d4, the queen can run away. But imagine there were like a bishop on c5, right? Do you see how the fact that there's an open line on the queen could be the basis for a tactic there? So as Hallelujah Cat says, things can change, right? So is this like a usable tactical feature in this position, the hidden attack of the bishop on the queen, or the fact that there's an open diagonal to this queen? Yes, it's usable. You can potentially use it for a tactic, so I consider it a tactical element. So from my perspective, you can get to this particular diagonal. I don't know if that's what you're asking for. Let's say instead that we're talking about a long diagonal to this rook, And I still have one bishop on the board, but it's like tucked on b1, and I've got pawns on c2, d3. C2, d3, e4, and a bishop on b1, and an open diagonal. That would be an example of an open line to a valuable piece, and technically maybe in like 13 moves I could trade off all the pawns in the center and play bishop e4. That's an example of a tactical element I would not keep track of and would not pay attention to because it's multiple steps away from becoming relevant. Just like in the very starting position, each player starts with 4 undefended pieces, completely undefended. But I do not keep track of those from the start myself, and I'm not asking you to, because they're completely out of range of any attacking piece, and it's effectively irrelevant. I only start paying attention to that once like knights come in contact with the poorly defended squares here, right? Once knights come in contact with like c7 or f7 or c2 or f2, which then become critical barely defended points, then the knight is in contact with a key point, and then I start caring about whether or not the rooks are defended or undefended pieces. Okay, but yeah, if something's like many steps away from being something you can get to, I wouldn't consider it. If it's something that's like 1 or 2 steps away from being something you can get to, then I definitely consider it a tactical element. So d4 is played. So now the knight goes from being an undefended piece to a barely defended piece. The queen is now like actually attacked. There's no longer a hidden attack. There's an actual attack between the queen and the bishop. So, it's important at this point to note, like, are these pieces defended or not defended? Which one's more valuable, etc. becomes important when they're actually just attacking each other. Queen takes g2. So what are the new tactical elements after this? The new tactical elements are there's no longer an attack between the queen and bishop. There's no longer an undefended pawn on g2. The undefended status of this rook has now finally reared its head and become critical. There's even an attack on that undefended piece. Okay, and e4 is now not only undefended, but it's also undefended and attacked. And now we play queen f3 for white. I mean, you might want to also consider like that the queen is barely movable. For the moment, it still has like diagonal and h3, but it has no retreats on this file. So that could be something to note, that this queen is potentially starting to get low on mobility. I think it's like a fair thing to realize. Definitely. That's a good one to have noted, Claude. So queen f3 is played, and now, in fact, like this queen on g2 basically has nowhere to move. That's like the first most obvious tactical element to this. I mean, I guess another one is that the rook is now defended and the pawn is now defended. Other new tactical elements, the bishop on c1 is no longer defended. That's now an undefended piece. f7, which was barely defended, is now not sufficiently defended. And this queen is now a barely defended piece. Right? So sometimes in positions like this, there are tactics where you go like, bishop h3, something, right? That's the kind of tactic that could be based on this queen being barely defended. That I just show that to tell you why it might matter that this queen is barely defended, or if takes, you renew this threat and win a pawn. In this case, it seems actually relevant that this f7 pawn is undefended, because that would probably be the main reason black wouldn't play the move bishop h3 here, right? Is because they have to notice that tactical elements, f7 is now actually just undefended and threatened. And also that it's a significant threat. Like, what happens if the queen comes to f7? You have to sort of like think a step ahead. What will the tactical elements be next move if we allow queen f7? All right. So takes on f3. What are the new tactical elements? Well, these are both undefended again, right? And this queen now does have mobility, but white chops it off. And now the new tactical elements. This knight is now undefended. This pawn is barely defended. Oh, that's the other one we missed here with queen f3. d4 is now undefended, right? And now, whoops. And now d4 is defended. But now this is undefended, this is undefended. This is undefended. This is undefended. Queen f3 also undefended. This pawn. See, moving away, the queen like defended 2 things but left 3 things undefended. Big effect from where it moved away. And again, even for me, who's the one cautioning you about this, I'm much less likely to keep track of what I'm moving away from. That's like the case for basically every chess player. That's just how it is. So everyone has to watch out for that and try and get better at noticing what's being moved away from in general when playing. Okay, so we're going to stop this game here. That's an example of what I'm asking you to do in this first exercise here, playing through the moves of a game and keeping track of the tactical elements as they appear and disappear. You're keeping track of tactical elements for white and for black, and you're keeping track of as they appear and disappear, and a sense of how many tactical elements does white have or black has. Now, once you've done that a few times, you need to practice bringing this into your own games with exercise 2 up here. Now you need to actually play like some Skittles game or even a tournament game, continuously tracking the tactical elements for yourself and your opponent. Now, when you first start doing this, this is like an extra 1 minute of work per move that doesn't even help you make your next move. So it's like, why am I doing this? This is stupid. This is certainly not helping you play chess. You're correct. It's not. It's an exercise you're doing to eventually play better, but it's certainly not an exercise that's improving your play during that particular game. Hence, I would suggest you probably practice it in sort of casual games, not tournament games. So it is an exercise, not a way of playing well. You do this again and again, and it will eventually start to become subconscious. I've had many students do this exercise, and that does eventually happen. At some point, you don't have to ask yourself, undefended, undefended, can't move, barely moved, barely defended, one hidden attack here and here. You don't have to do that anymore. At some point, you're just playing along, and you constantly and continually have a sense of which of your pieces are tactical liabilities and which of your opponent's pieces are tactical liabilities, and who's in contact with what, and what piece has many responsibilities, etc. You're just aware of it, and then it hits a certain point, and you're like, this is the point where there might be a tactic for me, and you actually look for it. Or this is the point where my opponent might have a tactic. I can't afford to grab another pawn. I have to clean up some of my weaknesses here. Okay? And we are going to do a separate lesson soon, hopefully, next time I get a chance to stream, I guess, where I will show you an entire game that's based on tactical elements, which is kind of like a cool bonus thing to show you the value and importance of this alarm system, and actually how you can make decisions based on tactical elements. How you can say, oh, I have this many bad tactical elements, I have to do this. Or, oh, my opponent has this many bad tactical elements, I'm going to play this way instead, right? It actually plays into strategy. Your current tactical strength or weakness and your opponent's current tactical strength or weakness doesn't simply dictate whether or not you have a tactic in that position, but dictates how you might play the position strategically, whether you're going to play to exploit someone's tactical weaknesses, or if you're going to play more conservatively to start shoring up your own, or something like that. Okay, so that is another lesson which we'll do separately, but soon, hopefully. And yeah, repeat those 2 exercises until it becomes second nature, and then you will have this alarm system letting you know when you have tactics and when you don't. And I'm